This is killer. Oh, no, 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 no. And here we are, because I'm clunky with all of this and Melinda is not. Welcome everybody to a special live stream. I have the privilege of being with my good friend Bobby Vala, who is the creator of Valaverse, the new Action Force action figure line that's coming soon. But we're not here to talk about toys tonight. Bobby and I discovered early on in our conversations that we have a mutual love for movie swords and, you know, swords in general, but specifically swords in, you know, famous films and great films with sword fights and everything like that. So we wanted to really talk about that, but we thought, why waste the conversation without bringing you guys into it? So Bobby, thanks for being here tonight on a weeknight and talking swords with me.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine, sir. I was excited, man. I'm excited for this one. I couldn't stop thinking about this one after we talked about it, and you were like, "Yeah, let's do it." I was like, "Okay, I wonder when we're gonna do it." And then you were like, "Yeah, how's next week?" And I'm like, "Whoa, like that quick? Okay, let's do it." And then like I couldn't stop thinking about swords.
Yeah, when I announced this, you know, people started saying, "Oh, well, is this sword going to be in here? And is this sword? Is this sword? Is this sword? And does this count? Does this count? Does this count?" So before we start down our path, I want to address some of the things that the viewers were saying ahead of this, and I want you to weigh in on some of this. All right?
Sure.
Okay. I want to start with this because everybody's going to wonder. I want to get it out of the way now, and I'm not trying to sound sarcastic or, you know, exasperated or anything like that. But yes, this is a sword. But I don't think it counts as, like, does this count, Bobby, as a movie sword, or does this count as a special effect?
Lightsabers are in a food group all on their own.
Okay.
Even though the lightsaber had a strong effect on me as a kid in my love of swords, they are not the same. They're not in the same category.
Yeah, that's kind of the way I felt about it too. It was like, if I have to swing something, I want there to be something on the other side that will really defend me. And I hate to say it, but we don't live in a galaxy far, far away. So I'm either swinging a polycarbonate plastic broomstick at somebody, it snaps, LEDs fall out, and then they beat me up behind a dumpster. Or I'm just swinging at air. So yeah, I love these as fictional swords, but that's not really in the category of iconic, you know, sword fight swords.
Yeah. I'll say this. I was very mad when I first saw Kylo Ren's lightsaber and they tried to make it seem like the pommel of a broadsword. And I was like, how dare you?
Yeah.
Stay in your own lane.
And also, yeah, that crossguard's dangerous to the user.
Yep.
Like, we have a super chat here from Analog Toys. Thank you so much. He says, buying you both a drink. Tony, we love you. We're glad that you're here. And I will, it's like with our Patreon. You'll buy me that drink and then I'll buy it right back for you. So we're just going to be trading that money back and forth. And then Laser Pants is here from the Infinity Equation podcast. Ryan, good to see you. He says, question for Mr. Vala. When you use Just for Men on your beard, do you go with the liquid or the foam?
I'm not there yet. I'm getting a few grays, but I'm going to embrace the gray. Like, I can't wait to get like a nice Sean Connery beard.
Nice.
So
nice.
I'm ready for it. I am.
All right. So I have one more debate that I want to bring up before we get started. It's in the same house as the lightsaber. I've heard it mentioned many times that this is a sword. I disagree, but I want to get your thoughts. So this is the bridge knife from Temple of Doom. The one Indy has when he cuts the rope bridge at the end. He takes it off of a thuggy guard. Now, some people have called this a thuggy sword. I understand why. It's longer than your average knife. It's longer than Rambo's knives. However, my feeling on it is that this is closer to or inspired by a Kyber knife, like a Afghani Kyber
Yep.
combat knife.
Yep.
But what do you think?
That's a knife.
Okay.
That is a knife.
Okay. So this is a knife.
It's
All right, everybody.
it's in the knife family.
Mhm.
I can't explain why I'm saying that, but I look at it and I say that's a knife. It's not, I can't look at it and feel like, oh, I could pick out attributes that could lean both ways. But no, to me, that's in the knife family. It's on the larger end of the knife family, but it's in the knife family.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking too.
Which, if you think about it, like Achilles' sword or like Maximus's sword and Gladiator are probably the same length.
Mhm.
It's just different. It's just a different feel. I can't explain it, but definitely a knife.
And I was thinking like the name of the sword that looks closest to this in reality is the Kyber fighting knife. And it says knife. They don't call it a Kyber sword. But again, some people are like, well, but this is the Thuggy cult. I'm like, all right, guys, split hairs, whatever you want to do. Gets back into that fictional area. All right, so let's get started. So, Bobby, tell me a little bit about how you found yourself fascinated by movie swords. Like what was the journey that you took as a kid? Because it always happens when we're kids. Like what was it that got you enthralled by swords, and then how did that progress for you as a kid who couldn't own any?
Sure. Well, I technically did own one, and I'm glad I brought this. Now the crazy thing is that when I bought this for my son at a flea market, I couldn't believe that 38 and a half years later, they're still making the exact same sword. But this plastic sword, this little Halloween cosplay little sword, this was the first sword I ever had. And there were pictures of me when I was like 5 or 6 with this sword. And I can remember like having this sword in multiple versions because, this got loose and it banged around, but it was like so cheap to get them. And it did the greatest job as like a little kid because it was the perfect size. So to me, that was where it all started, was this guy, this little stupid $2 sword. But that I don't know how the puzzle pieces fit, but we were talking about this just before the show. But I can remember the first movie I can remember actually sitting through and seeing, maybe not the first movie I actually went to, but definitely the first movie I remember sitting through saying, wow, I'm going to watch this whole movie. I was 6 years old. It was 1988 and it was Willow. And that movie just did it for me. It was fantasy, but it was like knights and that had that medieval feeling. And I can remember when Mad Mardigan goes into that armory and sees that gold suit of armor and that gold sword. And it was such a nice, like now that I see it now as an adult, like years later, I'm like, wow, they did those swords so well in that movie. There were some that were really raw and gritty. And then Mad Mardigan's was very like ornate, but also very simple and nice looking at the same time. And still to this day, I still remember the whole fight scene between him and General Kale. The fact that like, Eric gives him the gauntlet sword, and then it gets snapped in half, but then he stabs Kale with it, and then he uses Kale's sword to bring him down. But but his sword and his armor, like everything about it, the black and the gold, it all like fit perfect. And that's when I was like, wow, I think I really like love this genre. As a kid, I didn't think that like, oh my God, I love this genre. But that was kind of where it started for me. And then it was like the perfect time where like great fantasy sword movies were on TV. Like my mom let me watch like everything. So like I watched Legend as like a little kid. I'm watching all these like more adult like fantasy movies. So Legend and Lady Hawk and Excalibur. And it's like swords were just it. Like swords were in so many fantasy movies, and I just got into it. And then I remember she got me the Playmobil castle sets. And it's like they came with the vac metallized swords and the armor, and like it was like swords, medieval knights, everything. And like that it just kept rolling that way.
We have a super chat here from Scott Knudsen. Scott, thank you so much for the super chat. He says, I noticed Errol Flynn prominently in the thumbnail for the video. Did they bother making distinctive swords in that era of movie making, or was it just slap a generic blade on a crossguard? Glad you brought this up, because right before everything started, Bobby and I were talking about swords as characters and swords that have character rather than swords that are just there in the background to service the plot, right? Or service the action. To your point, Scott, right here, I have a photograph. There's a company called Albion Swords, and they make very, very quality, high end recreations of medieval swords and other types of swords. But a few years back, about a decade ago, they decided to tackle the Errol Flynn Robin Hood sword, which, by the way, back then in that era of movie making, as Bobby probably knows as well, they weren't as concerned with complete medieval accuracy for the weaponry. What they wanted was quick action. They wanted to be able to have a Zorro or Three Musketeers style sword fight choreography, but in the 12th century England. And the swords that were actually in 12th century England weren't designed for that. They're designed for dynamic fighting if you've seen things like Kingdom of Heaven. But this was a movie where the swashbuckling era was going on, Seahawk and all that kind of stuff. So what they did was they designed a sword that was, it had character. This sword is unique to Errol Flynn, meaning they made it, this was, in other words, in the movie, from what I can recall, he's the only person that carries this style hilt of sword. It's a smaller sword that can be held in one hand with a thinner blade that's lighter that can be whipped around. But as you can tell, it still retains a certain proportion of medieval broadsword or arming sword dimensions. They wanted that flat diamond-shaped blade. And the funniest part is, and I'm working on a video about the history of Robin Hood in media and TV, or film and TV, going all the way back. After Errol Flynn did that movie, Scott, Columbia Pictures did a number of Robin Hood films. Warner Brothers did the Errol Flynn one, but Columbia Pictures did a number of follow-up Robin Hood movies to try and capitalize on the success of that one. And they went to the same prop master. And so like 3 or 4 of those movies, whoever's playing Robin Hood, they got the same sword for him to carry. So he's actually carrying that sword. So that sword ends up being like the Robin Hood sword for the first 50 years of the 20th century. Like it's really crazy the way that worked out. But yeah, I hope that answers your question, Scott. So yeah. So sorry about that, Bobby. So we were
No, that sword, that's a gorgeous sword. You know, for a movie at that time period, that sword had character, man. Like that sword's gorgeous.
Yeah, and back then, of course, you know, they were making them out of, for the fighting, they were making them out of almost like a as my thing jumps here, they were making them out of like this lightweight for the purposes of stunt work. It was made out of this material that I can't remember what it was called, but it was like fiberglass, but it was real chromy.
Okay.
And it didn't flake off like fiberglass does. Like when they did this, the prequels, those fiberglass rods were wrapped in like saran wrap to keep the flakes from flying into the actor's eyes and stuff. But if you watch the very last part of the big battle at the end of Errol Flynn's film, you can see he points his sword at a guard, and he's already been doing stunt work all day or something, and that sword is bent, you know, like it, because it's not made out of steel when they're using them. So yeah, so when Albion did this sword, they made it out of functional steel, and they were like, let's interpret this sword as a real functional weapon, which I thought was a pretty neat thing to do. Vinkman, thank you for the super chat. He says, my first sword was this toy light up sword my parents got for me at a carnival at Foxborough Stadium, now Gillette Stadium. It was like a knockoff He-Man sword, but I used it as a lightsaber, as we all were wont to do. And then Salvador from 2 Cents Toys, thank you for the super chat. He says, at work, so I'll be listening in more than chatting, but here's the big question: one or two-handed, and why? Also, the most iconic sword versus the most famous. Example, Excalibur, very famous, but many different incarnations. I'm so glad you said this, Sal, because this was where the conversation was going with me and Bobby before Scott asked the question about the Errol Flynn sword. I'm like you, Bobby. I saw Willow, and I had already grown up on the Mark of Zorro with Tyrone Power and the Errol Flynn Robin Hood. So I was already very familiar and loving sword fights. And Empire Strikes Back, you know, all those movies that had those sword fights in them. When I saw Willow, it was like you. It was like this defining moment where that was the first movie that I was allowed to watch that had medieval style combat in it. You know, some people are going to get real uppity about that and say, "Nah, Willow's whatever." But I just mean the general look, the feel, you know, the two-handed swords. And that's what I was going to bring up, is that movie actually spoiled me when it came to finally learning about the real medieval stuff, because when I moved to England and I got all excited about going and seeing the museums with all the swords in it, most of the swords are not two-handed. Like, they
No.
don't get two-handed until around the time of, like, the Tudors or something like that. Yeah, they had
Yeah.
bastard swords and things like that, but it was very disarming, no pun intended, because
Well,
I'm like, oh, I'm thinking swords,
yeah.
lightsabers with two hands, Mad Mardigan's two hands, they're all two-handed. Excalibur was two hands,
Yeah.
What did, like, is that where your mind goes when you think of, your favorite swords? Is it always like a two-handed sword?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say so. I have some swords with me. It's like, thinking of, okay, well, Conan.
Mm-hmm.
He was huge. Now
Uh-huh.
the Conan sword. I'll take it out now so we can talk about it.
Oh, I don't even have to use my picture. I don't even have to use my photo.
The Conan sword is a much shorter sword than normal swords, but the blade is very wide, so it's a very heavy sword, and it's got like a blade guard here. But also Arnold Schwarzenegger was a huge man, so he can wield it one-handed, which was very impressive. And then there's one point where he grabs it by the blade, guard, and hurls it. I think that's when he hurls it through the guy in the mirror. So, I'm okay in that instance. To me, I feel like I like a sword that can be wielded one or two-handed. Now, swords that were one-handed, I think it was mostly because it was a lot of horseback, right? Like it was battling on horseback, but also you held your shield in your other hand. So you needed a sword that was quicker to whip around. And also, thinking of like the like different periods of swords, and even pirate swords, they're one-handed. So there was just that quick fighting, but it wasn't, I guess, until I don't know when, because Vikings fought with a one-handed sword. The Roman ages were one-handed swords. I don't know when it switched to two, but I've always been a fan of two, because there's just something about fighting two-handed. And in Kingdom of Heaven, when he's training him, and the Falcon, I forget what he calls it. I don't want to mess it up, but the Guard of the Hawk, like, you're fighting two-handed, you're coming at him, and even lightsabers, it was more two-handed. It's great when Darth Vader was like forcing Luke off with one hand, like, get back. But yeah, just long-winded answer, but two-handed swords were always for me.
Yeah, the one-handed thing I've gotten used to it since I was 10. Like, I've finally made peace with it after my teenage years. But it was weird, because I had always, after Willow, it was with Willow that I realized that the Errol Flynn Robin Hood movie was making concessions so that they could swashbuckle with the swords. And watching things like Mark of Zorro, and then watching like the Three Musketeers and Princess Bride.
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with rapiers as weapons and sabers and things like that. In the early days of cinema, like in the Mark of Zorro and stuff, you would have rapier swords proper, but then when they started fighting, like Basil Rathbone and Tyrone Power in that final sword fight in the sheriff's office, not the sheriff, but what I'm talking about, the Don's office. It's almost like they're fighting with fencing foils. They're not really fighting with bladed sabers. Now, the fight choreography itself is one of the best fights that's ever been put on film. But it ends with a stab. It's like, he does get cut at one point, but I keep wondering, I'm like, those swords don't look like they have edges on them. Like, so as I move forward and I saw Princess Bride, that was an eye-opening experience for me, just like Willow was, because that was where I finally saw Zorro swords that had the blades on them.
Sure.
Like, they were, and so, like, when you see the blades here for the Zorro, the Princess Bride swords, like, I saw an edge, I saw two edges, I saw a double-bladed sword.
Yeah, it has that diamond shape, that flat diamond shape.
Yeah. And I realized, oh, okay, well, you can actually fight, one-handed with something like this. Dread Pirate Roberts, his sword was a little more basic, but it was the same idea. And then when I know this movie's not loved by people, Say it right now. I know that people don't like the movie, but I love the sword in the movie, the swords in the movie. I love the way they did the swords in the Three Musketeers Disney film.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
swords there look great. Now, will I ever like prioritize owning one of those? Probably not. Like, I don't know if I'd go after a sword like that, because again, I'm not that into that era of swords and sword fighting. But I just want to acknowledge it because I think it's a great sword. So
Yeah, I agree, and you know, you made an interesting point about the parrying and the fencing, sort of fighting with a more rapier saber type sword.
mhm.
The movie that kind of like changed that, or like kind of married two different styles of sword fighting, was Rob Roy. So
Yeah.
Rob Roy had a very pommel guard type rapier, but his was thick. It was thick and broad. Where when he fought Tim Roth, he had a more rapier styled, thinner Three Musketeers type sword. But Tim Roth was fighting in that very traditional fencing parrying pattern and fight style, where Rob Roy was just coming down with these blunt attacks, and you know, cuts through him at the end, and you know, there really was no stabbing, but that was seeing two different styles of sword play, and that's why I find this sword fight one of the best sword fights in all of movies.
Yeah, it's brutal, it's
Yeah.
quick, and it is the only way to describe it is it's death by cleaving. Like it's yeah, for real. Wicked Person has a super chat. Thank you for the super chat. He says, to the best of knowledge, the professional term for fake movie patty cake sword play is still flinning. Nice. And it's still great to watch. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting. George Aitken says, the Kelvin Grove Museum in Glasgow has a great medieval collection of swords and a Spitfire hung from the ceiling. That immediately makes it my favorite museum. You know that, right? So
Wow.
it's my favorite museum ever now.
Trip.
And then let's see, we have one more here, or two more here. Matt Movies 611. Matt Movies 611, great YouTube channel. Thanks for being here. He says, one of my favorite swords is easily Mad Mardigan's. Kilmer was a fantastic sword fighter. Yeah, we just talked about that earlier in the stream. And Wicked Person, thank you so much for the kind super chat. He says, one-handed swords predate heavy steel armor and good steel production and follow it too. No two-handed bronze or iron swords. Two-handers are about getting through heavy steel armor, which was only practical before guns. Good point. Very true. Very true. All right. So, Bobby.
Yeah.
We're now in our, let's see if I'm following this correctly, we're in mid to late adolescence at this point, early teenage years, I believe, given our ages. Where were you on your sword journey at this point?
It was like when I became like a teenager, middle school, high school teenager. I then, you know, unfortunately got out of the things I loved as a kid and got more into playing sports. And I was, you know, all about playing hockey and rollerblading, you know, doing aggressive skating. And I was still into the things I loved, but I think I fell off a little bit there. And then it wasn't until after high school, when I started going to art school for, you know, drawing comics, that all my love of things just came back to the surface again. So I had a little bit of this lull. So I think I'm trying to think, like, during that time, my teen years, what movies were coming out that had a lot of sword play. I don't think there were many.
No, they seemed, we were in the era at that point of movies like The Rock and Die Hard. The whole Die Hard series was out. It was the 90s was very much, aside from things like the 1993 Three Musketeers, the 90s was very much a gunplay decade. I mean, I'm not going to say there weren't sword fighting films. I mean, of course there were, but not many to my knowledge. We had Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves in 1991, which I know you wanted to talk about the one sword in there. That, you know what though, this brings up a great way to start the conversation about swords with character versus swords that just get the job done in the background of the film. So talk to me a little bit about what you'd mentioned right before we started about your experience with the swords in Prince of Thieves.
Yeah, so which is great because then it'll segue into the 2000s and movies had come out there, which was a big influence on my sword collecting and love of swords. But yeah, Prince of Thieves was a big movie for me because it was prime, like, kid age for me. I know, some people that are older than me are like, it wasn't for me. And it wasn't for everyone. Like I had a best friend who we were the same age, and he couldn't stand the Robin Hood toys, where I had everything. I had Sherwood Forest, I had all the figures. I loved the movie, watched it every week.
Yeah.
And that movie, I just loved it. It was Robin Hood, and it's like, Robin Hood, the bow loving, shooting arrows kind of, Disney movie classic, but also Errol Flynn kind of thing. But I didn't know about the Errol Flynn Robin Hood until my later years.
Right.
So to me, it was just like Disney Robin Hood and then Robin Hood Prince of Thieves. But they gave it that medieval feel. It had that grittiness, and it had swords, and it was a lot of swords. And we were talking before how the swords that they had in the movie they didn't have a lot of character. They were just very, very basic, except for the Locksley sword, which was very ornate but very large. Everything else was just basic. But also, we were talking, you kind of filled me in on the history of it and how they were very true to the period. But what I also loved about that movie was when he's fighting the sheriff at the end, there are chunks taken out of his blade because his father's sword was this thick, broad sword. And, it had that realistic feel to it when they're fighting. And at one point, the sword gives way and the sword gets cut in half. But leading up to that, it's just beat to crap. And it's like, you don't see that in a lot of movies where swords take damage like that. And I love that they paid attention to that sort of detail. But just the fact that he had Robin Hood had a sword, it was like, it just made him so cool. And I hated that the figures didn't have a sword. So I would always try to find a sword that fit with him, because to me, it was like, he should have a sword. He's Robin Hood, and he had a sword through the whole movie.
I've often considered just going out and buying like 7 Sheriff of Nottinghams just to get a few swords.
That was a good sword.
My other guys. Yeah.
Yep. That was a good sword.
And I was, very fascinated by seeing the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves movie in 91, because I was living in the UK at the time. So I got to go to Nottingham and Sherwood and stuff like that. But this is a sword live stream, guys. I promise it's not a Robin Hood live stream. That's coming. Not the live stream, but the video. But to your point, I'll bring out the first sword of the day over here.
All right.
So by coincidence, it just so happens that my first sword, which is an arming sword, it's a 12th century. Let me lift this up here. It's a replica of a 12th century arming sword.
That's pretty.
So it would be something that, and this is a functional sword from Deltin in Italy. It is not a stainless steel. I got this in the late 90s, and come to find out, I hadn't watched Prince of Thieves in a real long time and didn't realize what I was buying. But this is a sword that would have been carried by Crusaders, Templars, knights and guardsmen of that period, the 11 and 1200s. And when I watched Prince of Thieves, it just so happens that this sword, I'm putting it on the wrong side, Michael, geez. This sword happens to look almost identical to the sword that Robin Hood carries in that film through most of the movie. It's not a Robin Hood Prince of Thieves replica. It just happens to almost be the same sword. And I thought that was pretty funny. It must have been like a psychological thing with me, because Museum Replicas has a huge catalog, and especially back then, and to go through that whole catalog and then pick that sword, kismet. So all right, so let's see. Let me just check everything here. Oh, we have a few super chats. Let me make sure I grab them. Wicked Person says, any Antonio Banderas Zorro love? I was just about to bring that up. So 1998, we do get, right at the end of the decade, we get the Mask of Zorro with Antonio Banderas. Have you watched that recently?
Not recently. It's been a number of years.
I got it on 4K, and I watched it with Melinda several months ago. And those sword fights, they really hold up. I mean, those sword fights are really good.
I'll have to watch. It's a great cast.
Yeah.
So I remember it being a very entertaining movie, so I'll have to put it on my list for this week.
Yeah. I also found out something interesting that gave me a lot more respect for that movie, because its sequel was trash. But I found out that the character Antonio Banderas is playing in that movie is actually inspired by a real Spanish or Mexican bandit at the time. So how do I put this? The guy, do you remember the dude that was the cavalryman that was his enemy? The
Yeah.
blonde dude?
Mhm.
His name was Captain Love. That is actually the name of the guy in history that finally caught and killed that bandit.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and cut his head off, and they said kept it. So when his brother in the
All
movie
right.
is killed and his head is put in a jar,
Yeah.
and his name in the movie is Murrieta. Well, in history, that guy's name was Murrieta. So they actually, I was like, wow, the screenwriters, I have a lot more respect for them now. Like they didn't just ape the old
Yeah.
Dora, like they actually put some thought into
Interesting.
who this guy is going to be to carry on the legacy. Anyway, I know I'm not talking about swords. Sorry about that. All right. So 1998. Now we're in the 2000s.
Yep.
So before we leave the 90s, I
Sure.
got to ask you, what did you think of this sword?
I guess I can get into it now.
Uh-huh.
So, when it comes to swords, I said two-handed are for me. But what is not for me is the oversized broadsword.
Uh-huh.
So when I think about the Loxley sword,
Mm-hmm.
this Braveheart sword. Also, I love the movie Lady Hawk. His sword is absurdly huge. To me, there's a scene in Braveheart where in the battle where he first uses this sword and they're running and
Mm-hmm.
he's trying to pull the sword from the weird half sheath on the back, and it's real awkward looking, him trying to pull this sword out from his
Right.
back. I'm like, that sword is the furthest thing from function. And
Yes.
what I never liked about it was they go the whole movie, they never talk about like where the sword came from, this iconic sword, which is now so iconic because of this movie, but they didn't explain. All of a sudden he's using these small short swords and deer antlers and stuff, but now all of a sudden he's got this ornate broadsword. So it was kind of one of those things where I was like, it doesn't do it for me. And like I said, the giant sword is just, it's a little too much. If Arnold was carrying this, great, but like I said before, with the Conan sword, they did it right. It's a short, fat sword that he can wield one-handed because he's
right.
big. But this sword, it just, if I were in battle, I'd find a guy wielding a sword like this because I'd say, I'm going to let him take one swing at me, and when he's coming through his backswing, that's when I'm going to stab him because that sword is going to take him all the way around.
Yeah, with my tiny Roman sword, I'll just get him, right there.
Yeah.
Or my gladiator sword, I'll just
Yeah.
get him. Wolfie, thanks for the super chat. He says, that's good steel. That is Alan Rickman, of course, after he
At
stabbed.
least I didn't use a spoon.
And then Venkman, thank you for the super chat. He says, part of me still wants to use that Kenner Sherwood Forest as an alternate Ewok Village playset, just like Michael suggested many moons ago. You can't beat it, man.
Can't beat it.
You lose the drum, but you get the tree canopy.
You get the tree canopy. So good.
So worth its weight in gold. Salvador, thank you for the super chat. He says, arguably the best sword beyond Excalibur, Conan, and even lightsabers, the old wrapping paper tube. This is a good sword, Aragorn.
Yep.
How many wrapping paper tubes did you wear out?
Oh man, and it's fun. I'm glad other kids did this because I always look forward to like Christmas time or like when people had birthdays because it's like my mom would wrap a gift and I would take that tube and I'd sit there with my box of Crayolas, and when the box had silver in it, oh, it was great. Or it's like I would do the hilt silver because I would make lightsabers out of them. And I'd sit there and I felt like as a kid it took forever to color that tube green and silver and make my lightsaber. But it was probably like 20 minutes. But it felt like forever. And then the tube lasted even less because you were just swinging it around and it just unraveled. It's that I'm so glad other kids did that. And I can't wait till my son does that for the first time.
I'm slowly realizing, and I'm glad we're having these asides because it's allowing my brain the chance to catch up before the audience burns me in effigy. I'm slowly realizing that we have forgotten a major, major sword movie of the 80s that we need to discuss.
Oh.
Is that a hint? It's Highlander with Christopher Lambert. I didn't grow up watching this movie in the 80s. I didn't see it till it was on Laserdisc in the 90s. But I loved it. But the swords were all over the place. What did you think, Bobby, of the Highlander swords?
So it's unfortunate for me to admit this. I've never seen Highlander.
Wow.
I've never seen it.
Okay.
Yeah. I know I'm probably gonna get roasted for that,
That's
but
why you didn't recognize Christopher Lambert's laugh when I just did it there.
yeah,
Okay.
I will. And as we were talking about this, I thought to myself, like, as I was thinking about this all week, I'm like, Highlander's going to come up, isn't it? And I said, I'm going to look bad because I've never seen Highlander.
Dude, there's sword movies I've never seen. I haven't watched every movie with the sword. There's not a prerequisite. Tim Witten, he jumped me the other day on a live stream because I admitted I didn't watch any Highlander movies past the first one. And he was like, what? I said, they're all terrible. And I said, the tagline is there can be only one. And he wins in the end. So there's nowhere to go. Like, but the interesting thing about the sword, there are many swords in the movie. Some of them are very fantastical, and it would turn your stomach to see some of them. Like the bad guy's sword is a big two-handed broadsword, but it's got extra blades that flick out of the crossguard. And then he carries it in a suitcase and puts it together like a sniper rifle. So like the blade is in half and he clicks it together, which I just don't think that would work.
That seems very time consuming.
Yeah, time consuming, and just I don't think that would hold up to the swinging and stuff.
Yeah, you don't want stressful.
But this Katana Sword is very iconic. It's the one Sean Connery ends up giving to Christopher Lambert.
Okay.
When they did the television show, they changed the design of this dragon hilt. They made it longer. The dragon had a longer snout. It's actually a different sword. This actual Highlander style Connor MacLeod, Christopher Lambert sword is much harder to acquire. And I don't know if there's ever been a company that's done it in functional steel. Not to my knowledge, they have it. The company that licenses this sword out of Spain, Marto, they charge like $600 and it's still stainless. So like, I don't know about anybody out there, but I'm not paying $600 for a sword that can't be swung. Like I'm just, yeah. And then before we leave the 80s, I know we mentioned Excalibur. What do you think of this sword?
So the Excalibur sword is very, very close to Mad Mardigan's sword, like very close. They're almost identical. I love this sword. To me, it was like this sword had character. When you think about, King Arthur, media has always done like Excalibur is this I don't know, this overly ornate or overly characterized sword when it shouldn't. It should be iconic, but still a very functional sword because Arthur was a fighter, not just, a king who just carried an ornate sword. So I love this sword. Because like I said, it's so close to Mad Mardigan's sword and just the simple nature of it, but the blade is nice. It's not too thick, but it's thick enough. It's great. I can't say enough about it.
I remember seeing that sword all the time at the mall knife store, the United Cutlery or Knife World or whatever it was called. And it was always, with the Rambo knives and stuff, and it was on the wall behind the counter. And I was always like, wow, like that sword is so cool looking. Like it looked like the quintessential medieval fighting sword. It just looks so good. Before we leave the 80s, we got to give a shout out to what I think is the meanest looking sword in the 80s, and that is Sorsha's from Willow. Like I don't want to get stabbed by that. I really don't.
That's a awesome sword for her to have. It made her character like that much cooler. Like she was this badass girl that just was a fighter, and she had this nasty sword. Like who carries a sword like that?
I would. Like I'm glad the cutting edge is effective, but that stabbing portion, once those serrations get into you, you're done for.
Oh, you're done.
No way. And then lastly, this is going to be kind of obscure before we go into the 2000s, but lastly, I wanted to mention a film. I don't know if anybody's heard of it. I'm sure somebody's heard of it on the chat. It's called Mio and the Land of Faraway. Now, this is a legit movie from Sweden. They called it The Land of Faraway in the United States. Notable for us because the villain is Christopher Lee. Susanna York is in it, who played Superman's Kryptonian mother.
Okay.
And Christian Bale in one of his Yeah, and one of his earliest roles, not as the star, he didn't play Mio. He played the friend of Mio named, I kid you not, his name is Yum Yum. All right, but here's the sword that Mio is given when he goes to the land of Faraway. It's actually a pretty cool looking fantasy sword. Like it's got a nice broad blade on it. And as a kid, I always thought it was pretty, no pun intended, pretty sharp. Like I thought it was a pretty cool looking sword. Yeah, it's got like the fairy tale cross guard, but like the blade looks really good. Like I like the way the blade looks.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let me see how many people are making fun of me for bringing up Mio in the Land of Faraway. Let's see here.
The question is, what should I watch first, Highlander or that?
Oh, Highlander probably.
Okay.
Highlander is Land of Faraway is. Remember how the Neverending Story is actually a German movie?
Yeah.
But it was made to appeal to an English-speaking market. Well, Land of Faraway is the same way. It's a Swedish production, but it was made with a lot of British actors speaking English to appeal to the English-speaking audience. And it's not a bad movie. It's just a very simple, straightforward movie. I think it uses its budget very well, but it does it in that Swedish storytelling style that can be very different, very much more fairy tale storybook fantasy sometimes than Lord of the Rings or anything like that.
Got it.
But I watched that tape until I wore it out. I thought it was a really cool movie. He even has an invisibility cloak in that movie, which predates Harry Potter by 20 years or whatever. World Made of Cardboard wants to know any Action Force figures in the works with swords.
So, interesting question. So, Karak, the character Karak, who is named after a castle from the Crusades. If you'd seen Kingdom of Heaven, those of you who've seen it would know that, but it was also a real castle during the Crusades, and he's named after that castle. But his character takes a lot of history from medieval times and Templars and that sort of thing into his character and the way he does battle and uses his forces. And when I was designing the character, he's got this medieval helm, but I thought it would be cool if he had weapons like rifles and pistols, but also carried a broadsword.
Yeah.
But then I thought, okay, well, maybe that's a little much. So that's why I gave him the tomahawk instead, and he's got the shotgun sheath on his back. So I didn't want to go too crazy with the medieval flair to him. So, but I did think about giving him a broadsword at first.
Nice, like a Jack Churchill type of character. For those of you that don't know, Jack Churchill was a real soldier in World War II who'd been a veteran of, I believe, World War I. And he said a soldier is never, he's a British soldier, and he said a soldier's never fully dressed unless he's carrying a sword. And he is the only combatant in World War II to have on the record killed an enemy combatant with a bow and arrow.
Wow.
Yep. He was a wonderfully crazy guy. All right. So Ronin Blade brings up The Sword and the Sorcerer as a film that has iconic weapons in it.
Mm-hmm.
I freely admit I haven't watched that movie in probably 15 to 20 years. So
I was little last time I saw it.
Yeah. Brian Clark wants to know if we brought up Legend. Bobby brought up Legend. Mm-hmm. But Bobby, if you'd like to just espouse a little bit more about the sword in that movie.
Yeah, that sword it's a great sword. It's a little simple. Mm-hmm. But I think when you see Tom Cruise wielding it on screen, it doesn't have that diamond shape. It's very flat.
Yeah.
So to me, it doesn't look menacing or imposing, or it doesn't have a heroic look to it. And he's a heroic character.
Yeah.
So as far as swords go, not the greatest. I mean, Darkness has this gigantic, enormous sword that he wields at the end, but he uses it to kind of just point fire. They don't really like parry with it that much. Right. So, nice swords, but not, to me, not iconic. Not iconic in the sense that, like, you think of the movie and you think of the swords, whereas like something like Lady Hawk, it's like, I think of that sword,
Yeah, that big two-handed sword he's got.
Yeah, but also it's like in in movies, I like when they talk about the sword. Like there's the scene where he's telling Matthew Broderick about that's his family sword, and what the rubies are, and what they mean, and they're four different people in his family, and so the sword had character in it, and we'll get into Lord of the Rings, but those swords, they had character and they had meaning and backstory, and I like that about a sword when they end up talking about it. So when I got to that point about Braveheart, it's like, wait a second, you have this iconic Scottish blade that you don't even reference at all,
right? Yeah, it was weird to see that, and I know there was a lot of historical debate at the time about whether or not that sword was even in use in 1307 or 8 or 14 or whatever that was. But yeah, that was a point of contention. Although they do say that it was modeled after what was called an early claymore.
Got it.
But as we know,
that's what they're called.
Say what?
I couldn't remember the name of the large broadswords, claymores. That's right.
Well, but that's the funny part, because Rob Roy's sword is called a basket hilt claymore, and it's not two-handed; it's one-handed.
Interesting.
So,
okay.
Yeah. Let's see. Somebody just asked. Oh, here it is. What did you think of the Power Sword as shown in the 1987 Masters of the Universe movie?
That was a great sword. It had a very Conan feel to it. It was a very wide blade.
Mm-hmm.
But it was long. It was long from him, and I would have probably shortened that a little bit, because even the sword for He-Man as a figure, like that was a shorter sword. That wasn't a large, a long blade to it. And I remember seeing in one of I think it was Power of Grayskull, the documentaries, that someone had bought that actual sword from the movie, like the prop that Dolph Lundgren used, and the guy was saying how heavy it was, and Dolph, obviously a big dude, had to wield that thing. So it was great. It was well designed. I mean, it didn't have enough He-Man to it, but it was a gorgeous sword. I would have liked to have seen more of Skeletor's sword that he pulled at the very end. Mm-hmm. He pulls this sword and goes to strike at He-Man, and he gets knocked off. I wanted to see that sword because it has that bat wing shape to it, and you see it for just seconds. And I was like, oh, that looks like such a cool sword. It looked like it had a black blade to it, or a very dark gunmetal blade to it. So that would have been a cool one to see. But I got no issues with the He-Man sword.
Well, I'm glad that the Masters of the Universe thing was brought up, because I know that we're talking about like live action movie swords for the most part, but I don't want to impose too many hard rules on the discussion, because iconic swords, also are in literature where there's nobody swinging steel. They're just described. And I see that behind you have a famous sword from a cartoon.
I do.
And I too have one famous sword from a cartoon. I'm going to have to grab it because it's right here, but I totally forgot to put it behind me. So tell us about the Sword of Omens from Thundercats and why you're fascinated by that sword, while I grab my cartoon sword.
Yeah. So let me just fix my sword so they don't fall. So the Sword of Omens, as a kid, I was a huge Thundercats fan, and the Sword of Omens was a very, very iconic looking sword. I think there was something cool about it being a dagger that grew into a sword, but it was just, I don't know, there was something about it. It was just iconic. And as a kid, I loved it. And as I was collecting swords, like I was always on the lookout for Sword of Omens, and I saw like really, really bad knockoffs, and just really, really, really bad. And I came across this one. It's stainless, so it's kind of a knockoff, look at that, 440 stainless steel made in China, but it was so well done. They had such detail in it. I would have liked this to be a little more crystal, like it's flat, and it's, this is the worst part about the sword, but it's very, very heavy. The blade is very, very thick. It's a very robust replica for being just a $100 knockoff, but it was the best one I had seen yet. So I said, I got to have one in my collection, because it is a very cool sword. I think just the angles of it, there was something about it. I can't really explain it, but it was cool, and I always, you know, sort of gravitated to it as a child, and I always wanted that Sword of Omens, the LJN one, the role play one they made, which goes for hundreds of dollars now. But now it's cool to actually like own a real one. So this
looks
is
great. I mean, it really looks the part. I mean, it
yeah.
looks like translated into reality. That's what it
Yep.
would look like.
Yep. Now, granted, it's like flat blade edges, so I'm not
Sure.
cutting anything with it, but it's well made. It's a very well made sword.
The one cartoon sword that I own, which is one that captivated my imagination all the way through life, and I found out too late that they had actually made it into a functional sword. I was like years late because I'd been in grad school and then I was working at a crappy newspaper job, trying to make ends meet, and you don't have time to look at expensive stuff.
Yeah.
But then when I figured out that it existed and then finally tracked one down, it had gone up in value. But I actually have the real world interpretation of Snake Eyes part 2, his version 2 falchion, as they called it. It's his most, I think it's his iconic sword from G.I. Joe. But they even worked in the as you can see there, right by the
Washikagi,
which I know is not on the actual blade, but this sword next to the lightsaber and the Robin Hood sword, the Errol Flynn Robin Hood sword, is one of the most iconic swords from my childhood, kind of like you with the Sword of Omens.
Yep.
And they never made a role play toy for this like they did with the Thundercats sword.
Yeah.
So like I had the Voltron role play sword and I had the Thundercats role play sword. There was nothing for this. So when I finally saw that this was a thing, I was like, I gotta have this. So yeah, this is my one cartoon sword.
It is incredibly iconic. And the interesting thing about Snake Eyes is we all think of him as a ninja. Well, he was a commando. And then when we thought of him as a ninja in 85, he had that, which isn't a katana. He didn't have a katana until the 90 or 91 version, which everyone hates. I love that version, but it wasn't until then he had this neon orange katana then. So it was so interesting that as a ninja, he never had a true katana, but yet that sword is so iconic with the eagle head at the end of it.
What's that?
I said with the eagle head at the end of it.
Oh, with the eagle head at the end of it and the notch in the blade, so the blade kind of like gets narrower and then boop, and then it's got that mean looking end on it. And I mean, it just looks like the kind of thing that you could get into a major sword fight with, but also then like oddly, rip down a sail of a pirate ship with as well. Like it's just this very versatile looking sword. Jim Largo, thanks for the super chat. He says, oh, thank you so much for the kind super chat. He said, sword's a thing of beauty, but Indiana Jones showed us why you don't bring one to a gunfight. Great show, guys. Yeah, Jim. The funny thing about that is I had somebody sort of make that joke as well. And you're absolutely right. Fortunately, in most of these stories and movies that we're talking about, they are set in a time period or scenario where guns don't exist. So this is your best option. Obviously, G.I. Joe, it's a little different, but yeah. And then World Made of Cardboard says, what about the Power Star from Black Star? It's a cool concept for a sword, the crystal Star Sword and the Power Sword. In reality, though, it's a pure fantasy weapon like the lightsaber. I mean, there's no reality where we could fabricate one of those, have it look the way it's supposed to look, and also it be, I don't know, a durable weapon. That's just my take on it, Bobby. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree with that.
Yeah. Now, speaking of the Snake Eyes sword, this is probably the best time before we get into because guys, when we get into the 2000s, Bobby and I are just going to go like a freight train. I know we've been holding off, but I do want to bring up one more sword. It is fictional in its creation. In other words, it's not a historical weapon, but it relates to the whole Storm Shadow, Snake Eyes, ninja craze of the 80s. This is the Ninjato that was made famous in the Shokasugi ninja films like Revenge of the Ninja, Ninja 3, The Domination. And a lot of people seem to not realize that this sword, which is a very short-bladed ninja sword, it's the one that you see in all the ninja movies. This is the one that you see in Revenge of the Ninja. It's the one you see Lucinda Dickey glowing in her closet, and it possesses her. And in Ninja 3, and then she goes crazy, going after cops and cemeteries and all kinds of stuff. But this sword was created in the 80s by Sho Kosugi, allegedly. Like, he developed it as a ninjutsu trained martial artist and a ninjutsu guy that was going into films. He apparently created this to be his go-to ninja sword, and then sold them in ninja catalog or martial arts catalogs in the 80s. But they were not, from what I understand, they were not functional. I think a lot of them were stainless steel. Don't quote me on that, but I think they were. But this one was made by a gentleman who was a massive enthusiast of Sho Kosugi, as I am. And he wanted to finally make this sword functional and respectable, like a, almost in the same way that a katana would be made, with real steel and all that kind of stuff. So this is a 1980s style ninjato, the Sho Kosugi style, the Revenge of the Ninja. So
very nice.
Yeah,
very nice.
One of my prides and joy that Melinda got for me several years ago, and I couldn't believe that she got me one because the guy literally made them himself. Like, there's nowhere to buy those. So,
so it's like getting a Hattori Hanzo sword.
You must have a big grudge to need Hanzo steel. Yeah, it was in a sense. I don't know if it's that well made. Like I wouldn't call it made by a master, but it's clearly made by somebody who used the real steel, did the real, clay firing, whatever, and had real love put into it. And, ninjas, they didn't have the best blades anyway. They had a blade that would hold up to abuse and get the job done. Mm-hmm. So in that respect, I have no doubt this sword would hold up to that. All right, we have a few super chats here real quick, and then Bobby and I are going to get into the 2000s, and this is where the conversation won't stop. Chris Johnson, thank you for the super chat. He says, I don't have anything to add to the conversation, but I wanted to work in Action Force rules into the night. Action Force does rule. It's time for action, and I can't wait for that action figure line to come out. Bobby, do you know about Action Force?
I've heard of it.
It is this really cool line of action figures that's coming out soon, and I mean, if you don't know about it, you should check it out.
I'll look into it. I mean, if it's good quality, I mean, if the characters are cool, I'll
be interested to hear what you think, because I think they look top notch. But I'll be interested to hear what you say.
I'll check it out. While I'm watching Highlander.
Say what?
While I'm watching Highlander, I'll look into it.
Oh yeah. I am interested to hear what you think of that movie. Scott Knudsen, thank you for the super chat. He said, credit where it's due. One thing I do love about some modern filmmaking is the use of swords in world building. You can look at a weapon from Lord of the Rings or Game of Thrones, you know exactly who made it. Yeah, that's true. Like, you can tell a way to workshop, blade these days for sure. And then Raymond, wow, thank you for the super chat. Thank you so much. He says, as an admirer of Japanese swords and swordplay, Kurosawa films being the best example, I have to confess a love for Jubei's ninjato in the anime film Ninja Scroll, due to the clever ways it's utilized as a life-saving measure in addition to combat. Raymond, your love of the ninjato is shared by me. So very much so. We're in the same camp, my friend.
Raymond, all right. I've said it on several podcasts. I would love to get the Ninja Scroll license and do Ninja Scroll figures. That's one of my all-time favorite anime movies, or just animated movies in general. I didn't find it until I was in my 20s. And I got it on DVD and I watched it, like every week for years, just because it was just so well done. And yes, I loved when he had that sort of fishing line to it, so he was always able to get it back to him and use it in those moments. So,
I have a terrible confession to make about that. I have seen it, by the way. It's not a Highlander confession, but I haven't seen it since we owned it on official VHS.
Wow.
Yeah. I
Wow.
know. I just haven't gotten back around to watching it, and I keep hoping because Ghost in the Shell just came out on 4K, so I bought that on 4K, and Ghost in the Shell and Ninja Scroll were out in the 90s at the same time. So I'm crossing my fingers that Ninja Scroll will suddenly be released on 4K. I know it's on like
Yeah,
Blu-ray, I think, but I'd love to just skip 2 generations and just buy it for the last time.
that would be
Um,
amazing.
yeah, but we'll see. All right, we are now in the 2000s, guys, and this is where, this is where swordplay and movie swords start to take on a lot of character. So, Bobby, where would you like to start in the 2000s?
I think there's only one place to start, and I think we're going to Middle Earth.
Yeah,
Yep.
yes, we are. Lord of the Rings, everybody. Weta Workshop's blades in Lord of the Rings were. It's hard to say, how do you reinvent the sword? But I really feel like with each blade, they reinvented the sword, like in
Yeah.
for movies. I really think they did.
Yeah. So funny story. I never knew what Lord of the Rings was until I saw the first movie. Now I didn't know I didn't know it was a book series,
Right.
and I went to go see the first movie with my friends, and I thought we were seeing a movie that was going to end with an ending.
Right.
And it got to the end, and I'm like, wait, I was all mad. I was like, wait a second. We're not going to see him throw it into the mountain. They're like, dude, it's 3 movies. And I'm like, what do you mean it's 3 movies? I'm like, well, it's a book. And I'm like, I didn't even know this going into it. However, I saw that movie and fell in love with it. And then for years, I immersed myself in just everything Lord of the Rings. I tried learning Elvish, which was a failed attempt, but I ended up finding a book that was called Weapons and Warfare. And it was a detailed book that went through all the weapons and all the swords and gave a detailed history of the sword from Tolkien's universe. Nice. So, and then watching all the behind the scenes on the extended versions, like seeing the guys from Weta make these swords and talk about what went into all of them, I was like, this is it. This is all I ever need for swords. Like they got it right, man. They got it right.
I'll start with, and I know that this photo is actually from The Hobbit. However, the sword prop itself is identical. Probably there are minor changes, but we're not going to nitpick that. This is this was one of the most iconic swords in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, which was Sting, which technically was an elven dagger, but for Hobbit scale, it's a sword. Little lament of mine is that we know that Weta Workshop made the sword to scale for Elijah Wood and Samwise or Sean Astin to carry so that it looked like a big sword when they were carrying it. When other people held it, if they ever did, it was always a scaled down sword so that it wouldn't be the size of their swords. To date, I have not found anybody that has made a scaled up version of the Sting sword, because I would like what I call the scale version, so that when you hold it, it looks like it does in anybody else's hand and not like this tiny dagger.
Sure.
I haven't found anybody that makes it look like that. I've always found it, the proportions are correct and the details are correct, but it looks like it's a bread knife, That
would be interesting.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Now, there are a lot of swords in that movie. They are all inspired by different styles and designs. Like the Rohirrim swords all look very Viking and Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah.
The Gondorian swords, they have their own style to them. But just so happens that Bobby and I share a love of the same sword, and Melinda, it's her favorite sword in The Lord of the Rings as well. So since Bobby is our special guest tonight, I will let you introduce this sword to the audience.
Sure. So the sword in question, let me just move some of the fellas here and get this one out. Although Michael probably has a real version, I unfortunately have not upgraded yet to the United Cutlery or Noble Collection version, but this is Strider's Ranger Sword, and I believe that is the sword we are talking about.
Yes.
Now, Aragorn is my favorite character in Lord of the Rings, and he's, everything about him is fantastic, even down to his sword. And he uses his sword. being such a great fighter in the movie, they gave him a sword that was sort of just the perfect weapon.
Yeah.
This sword, if you had to ask me what is my all-time favorite sword, I have two of them with me. This is my favorite all-time sword from a fantasy movie, and then I have another sword that is my all-time favorite sword of any sword from a real-world historical movie. But Aragorn's Ranger Sword is a two-handed, uh, I would call it a broadsword, but it was a little thinner. It's made to be used quickly, but just the detail of it, it's simple, yet it has all the characteristics of Aragorn. Like you look at this, and when he's a ranger, it kind of has that has a leather wrap, but together with the steel pommel and ring and insets. There was something about it that you just look at it and it fits exactly with his character. That sort of that grittiness, but durability. You look at the sword, you just look. It just needs durability. And when you watch him fight with this sword, it's when he fights that Uruk-hai at the end of Fellowship. That's a fantastic battle, even though it's not really sword on sword, because the Uruk-hais have like these weird, almost machete looking things, and it's not. He doesn't. When you think about it, he doesn't really sword fight anyone,
right?
Like sword on sword. It's all it's orcs and goblins and their blades, but he never fights anyone sword on sword. So, which is unfortunate, because I would like to have seen that, as good of a fighter as he was, and Viggo Mortensen put so much into the role. Everyone's heard that story of him going to the bank with his sword on him because he always had it. And there were so many things that he did. Like when he talked with the guys from Weta, he's like, well, how does he sharpen his blade? And they're like, well, why would you think of that? And he's like, so they put a whetstone in his belt. And then in the scabbard, he has that sort of that little paring knife that he uses when he goes in and he's searching for Kingsford when Frodo gets stabbed by the Witch King. So it's all those little things that go into this sword that make it just perfect. And I'd love to hear what Michael, what you have to add to it. But this is I can't say enough about this sword. It's amazing.
Yeah. I liked that sword the best because of, again, I started my sword journey in life with understated swords. I mean, this sword right here is understated, but it's functional. It's well made. It gets the job done. It's from a high quality blacksmith. I know this type of sword served people well in some of the worst hellscapes ever imaginable in human history. And that kind of translated over. It was almost like, and bear with me here, but I'm actually coming to this epiphany right now on the live stream. I feel like Viggo Mortensen's Ranger Sword was the perfect hybrid distillation of what my mind's eye saw in the Willow Madmartigan swords, the two-handed swords, combined with a large amount of medieval authenticity. So it became like this bastard sword. And the other reason that this sword is important to me is because it's important to Melinda. And I've always joked with Melinda that she's always very appreciative of gifts, but it's always 15 minutes to an hour after you give them to her. And so there's only two times well, three times if you count the Rambo knives, but that was a long time ago. There's only two times in recent memory where I've given her a gift and she's immediately elated and ecstatic. One of them was when I got Sylvester Stallone's signature for her, to her. The other is the Ranger Sword from Lord of the Rings. So this is my copy, not my copy, Melinda's copy, but the copy I have on the live stream of the Ranger Sword. I got it on the wrong side again. And this is from Dark Sword Armory. They do a functional version of the sword, and it is, as I bring it all the way, It is a functional, balanced, just beast of a weapon. I mean, this thing, and that's what I loved about that sword, is because the moment I knew that this was the sword that went through Helm's Deep, that this was the sword that went through Moria, um, this was the one that I was always going to salute the most
Yep.
in the film. And the other one, of course, is Sting, but Sting is really a knife, but it goes all the way to Mount Doom. And I tracked it. Like I would get paranoid watching the movie's continuity, going, well, is Sting still on Sam's belt when they jump onto the rocks and the lava? And I actually did a viewing one time on DVD tracking that sword to make sure that it made it all the way through without being just magically back or something like that. And they, true to form, they did. But yeah, the Ranger sword is far and away my favorite sword from Lord of the Rings, hands down.
It's funny you say that about watching the editing of it, because there's one part in Fellowship that always bothered me that they didn't fix somehow. It's when Aragorn is fighting the Uruk-hai at the end, and he takes out his elven knife from his back and stabs the Uruk-hai in the thigh. Uruk-hai punches him, he rolls down. Then Aragorn picks up his Ranger sword, and the Uruk-hai pulls the blade from his thigh, licks it, and throws it at Aragorn. And Aragorn baseball swings it and shatters the blade into many pieces. Yet puts it back in his sheath at the end of the battle. So it was like, that was one of those things I was like, oh, you couldn't, that was like one little thing, you know, but what are you going to do?
I wonder, I'll go back and I'll look at it because I've got it on 4K, and maybe, have you seen the movie? I guess you're talking about when you saw it in the theater, or
it's still on the extended versions. I have I think the Blu-ray extended versions. It's still shattered.
Okay, I'll check that out. I'll do a frame by frame, and see. I don't doubt you at all, but I love those continuity errors. You know, like I love it in Raiders when he pushes the rock out from the temple and it bounces down the hill because it's rubber, stuff like that. So like I love that stuff. So that's why I want to go check that out. But that is interesting. I had not picked up on that. I always thought it just kind of spun away. But I'll have to look.
No, if I mean, it's an elven blade, so if you think about it, his Ranger sword, if anything was going to shatter, it would have been his Ranger sword hitting an elven blade. But it's, the elven blade just explodes into pieces.
It must, you know what that must have been? That must have been a continuity error with the prop they were throwing at him to make sure that when he hit it, it didn't like spin into his face. Like they wanted it to disintegrate. Yeah. But you would think with their digital effects, they could have fixed that or something. Right. Before we go any further, because I know you have another Lord of the Rings sword there. I see it. Before we go any further, I want to do some super chats here real quick. Main Man 804, thank you for the super chat. He says, if you want a good laugh, Google the sword from Hawk the Slayer. 2 words, fist pommel.
All right.
Yeah, you know, Hawk the Slayer is one of those movies that I need to revisit. For some reason, every time somebody says Hawk the Slayer, I also think of Remo Williams, which is not even in the same. It's not even the same type of movie. And then let's see. Going down here. Knights of Old. Thank you for the super chat. He says, a big 90s sword moment. The scene in Pulp Fiction.
Oh, when Bruce Willis grabs the katana.
Okay.
Save Marcellus.
Right.
Yeah.
We could also argue that there are sword moments like that in The Bodyguard with Kevin Costner.
Yeah. To me, I like seeing a sword in its own, realm.
Yeah, me too. I'm the same way.
Yeah.
Let's see, and then let's see. Oh, it jumped again. Scott Knudsen, thank you for the super chat. He says, back in the 90s for a moment, I love Star Trek as much as the next guy, but hearing a bat'leth called a sword makes my teeth itch. I agree. It's a battle implement like a battle axe or something like that, but I do not consider it a sword. I agree with you. And then finally, the Thrill of the Hunt Collectors Podcast says, thanks for the super chat. He says, now I want to watch the Lord of the Rings movies extended cuts. Matt Ludi, I'm glad you brought this up. After we discuss the next sword that Bobby has, I'm going to bring this up. All right, Bobby, next sword from Lord of the Rings that you clearly admire.
Yes. And it also kind of goes back to my love of Aragorn.
Mhm.
And this sword starts off as Narsil, which
Uh-huh.
is King Elendil's sword, which is broken and cuts the ring from Sauron's hand, then reforged to become Anduril,
Uh-huh.
uh, which is then Aragorn's sword when Elrond gives it to him, and he brings it to go fight at the Battle of Minas Tirith and the Black Gates. This sword is a much longer sword. They said that King Elendil was a huge man.
Mhm.
When I read in that, I told you about that book, that Weapons and Warfare, they talk about him being a huge man, like he was very tall. So that's why the elves made him such a long sword, because this one
Yeah.
is considerably longer than the ranger sword.
Yeah.
Even the pommel is much longer. The crossguards are much longer, and it is a two-handed sword. It has a leather wrap here for it to be wielded one-handed, which Elendil can do because he was huge. But it can be held two-handed, which Aragorn does when he
Mhm.
says for Frodo. It's it makes me cry,
Right.
and he just runs into battle. And this sword's great. It's very elegant, but also has that durable, heroic feel to it. I
Mhm.
love this is not the true version, but I have a feeling that tonight, after talking about all this, I'm going to go and buy the real versions of this and the Ranger Sword, and probably Glamdring.
Well, how
Uh,
do you define
because,
real versions, though? How do you define that?
like I would say the official United cutlery,
So
or
so still stainless steel.
still stainless, but accurate detail.
Uh-huh.
I know. You like the sharp edge, a real
Mhm.
sword. To me, it's more about the detail. Like this is a crappy knockoff, so the Elvish is really muddy up here, and it's
Right.
just there's things about it. Whereas I want that nice, crisp feel as the sword was designed. Just because when it's hanging on my wall, I don't want to feel like, oh, that's just a knockoff. Um, but yeah, so I'm gonna upgrade. But this is a fantastic design sword, and the history of it is great, and I love the fact that in the story it was broken and reforged, and when it was reforged, it had a new name, and it almost became like this second character, like just like how Gandalf, when he was reborn as Gandalf the White, it was like this sword was reborn into something new and
Yeah.
different. And I love that in Anduril they added the Elvish down the blade,
Mhm.
which and then that the scene where Elrond just brings it to him and he whips it out and he goes, "They will follow the King of Gondor." It's like, oh man, gives me chills just thinking about it. I'm such a Lord of the Rings just nerd about it. I just love those movies so much, and yeah, this sword is definitely a very very close second. It
Mhm.
is definitely a more ceremonial looking sword. It doesn't have the grit of the Ranger sword,
Right.
but there's something very fierce about this sword that I just love.
It brings up a good question. What do you think happened to the Ranger sword after he takes Anduril?
I wondered that myself because you don't see it again. It would have been very cool if he gave it to Legolas. Wasn't really one to wield a sword. He wielded a Rohan sword at the Battle of Helm's Deep, but then he never wielded it again. It would have been cool if he gave it to Eowyn, but I think maybe that was too big of a sword for
Mhm.
her. But yeah, where did that go? And also, the interesting thing is when Aragorn gets this sword from Elrond, and he goes and he gets the army of the dead, and they show up at Minas Tirith. I don't like the look of him in his ranger garb wielding this sword.
Uh-huh.
However, his Pelennor Fields look when he goes to the Black Gate is probably one of my hands down favorite looks of a costume in any movie. And I feel like that look, that kingly look, goes perfect with this sword. So I would have liked to have seen this sword given to him with a different look, but it's fine. I'm just nitpicking here. But
Right.
the Ranger sword is just perfect for that character. So when you added this, it was almost like a clash of styles in a way.
Yeah. I was always happy with the way that the story played out, because I'd read the books in middle school, but I never knew until you showed it to me in person just now, because the way the sword sometimes looks when it's photographed, that pommel looks like it is massive. Like it almost looks like you could put your hand through the hole in the middle of it. Sometimes in the movie, it's like, whoa. But it looks actually very reasonable to manage.
Yeah.
Showed it there.
Yeah.
All right, let me just make sure that we haven't missed anything.
It's also a very comfortable sword to hold.
Oh, is it?
Just the way that the wrap has the the sort of the grooves in the leather, and then even this part of the pommel, it is a very balanced, very comfortable sword to hold.
Oh, well, that's encouraging, truly. All right. So we are now headed into now. Matt Ludi asked a question about Harry Potter's sword and our thoughts on that.
Sure.
I have a picture of it right here because I planned on bringing it up. This is the sword of Gryffindor. Here's my thing. I don't see this sword as formidable against a giant snake.
I agree.
This sword is very much a ceremonial sword.
Mm-hmm.
It looks very much like the swords used by the modern day Freemasons societies and lodges for their ceremonies with new membership and stuff. It goes back to a Victorian romantic period of time where swords were ceremonially used and symbolic, so they became not about function, they became about style. And it was just like this is a sword to do this with, on somebody's shoulders. So when I saw it in the movie, I was like, oh, this is kind of weak sauce. Like I was a little thrown off by it. Bringing it back around real quick to another kid's sword that actually looked more formidable, even though it's more fantasy than this sword, is the sword and hook. I know it has a coconut crossguard, but at least it's got a big, like formidable sting style blade on it.
The blade's a little more robust. Yeah.
But compared to this looks ceremonial. This looks like something that would be used in, a Knights of the Garter, ceremony in the now. It doesn't look like a sword that could fight a serpent. I get it. This sword is magical, so it's indestructible and it's got special powers, I guess. And I guess they needed a sword that was small enough for a bird to be able to fly it in there. But I'm not the wildest fan of this sword.
I'm with you too. Now I love Harry Potter and I read all the books, and I think going back thinking about the books, I don't remember them ever like describing what the sword of Gryffindor looked like. Now, I think the thing that got me is like, okay, well it's Godric Gryffindor's sword. Well, he was a man. Like he should have had a sword, like a real sword. And I just think that because Daniel Radcliffe, he was a little kid in this movie, they couldn't just have him pull out a huge sword. Right. So I think they probably took some liberties in making it like that. But I wonder if you asked J.K. Rowling like what her intentions were for the sword, like what it would have looked like in her mind. I wonder how she would have described it, because I think it was probably changed for the movie for the case of the actors.
Or maybe it's like the Ring of Sauron, where it shrinks or expands to fit the person.
But then again, when Neville pulls it out, it's little.
That's true. That's true.
And that's like, you wait for the scene, and it's an impactful scene, but it's like, okay, you used a letter opener to chop the head off Nagini, and it's like,
right.
Okay. It was a little letdown.
Yeah. Laser Pants, thank you for the super chat. He says it's only formidable against a trouser snake. Ouch. And then Wicked Person says, Peter's sword from the Narnia movies. Glad you brought that up.
Ooh.
Because we have a picture of it right here. And this is Peter's sword from the Narnia films. So, Bobby, I know this is one that you brought up that you wanted to talk about. Take it away, sir.
So this one, I loved the book growing up, and when this movie came out, I thought it was fantastic. I thought it was a very well done movie. They took some liberties with it, but I felt like the cast was great. Tilda Swinton, Liam Neeson as Aslan. But when everything was well designed, and I later come to find out that the reason I love the designs of things so much is because Weta worked on this movie. So the centaur's sword, the great sword that he wields when he's fighting, the Ice Queen, it is very much the Anduril or Narsil. It has the same shape at the end of the pommel. And then, Peter's sword oh man, I can't say enough about this sword. It reminds me of a little, as like Aragorn's sword with a little more flair to it. Like it has that two-handed, split grip to it. The lion's a very nice touch. The crossguard isn't overdone, and it has a very thick blade start. And it's not long. To me, it reminds me of like a Conan sword, but it's not too long, not too short. This was a great sword. I love this one. And going back to Weta designing it, I think that's why I like it so much. There's so much in that movie that I like as far as designs, but this is a great sword. I wouldn't mind one day getting this one. I think it's a little further down the list of swords that I want to get, but it's definitely on the list.
Yeah, it certainly does look real slick. I mean, I love the engraving in the fuller, and all that stuff. I think it looks great. All right, so we're now in the middle of Lord of the Rings, but are we moving out of Lord of the Rings now into the 2005 land, or are we sticking around?
I think we are.
Okay.
I think we are.
Okay. So we're, and it, you know what, Bobby, we have to compliment ourselves on the fact that as I beat up my Ninjato scabbard, we have to compliment ourselves on the fact that not only have we been talking about these swords for an hour and a half, but somehow we managed to get to the creme de la creme of movie swords right before the 90-minute mark, which I think that's like Japanese rail efficiency. Right there. That's amazing.
I was like, man, I think me and Michael are going to do a 3-hour live stream just talking about swords.
Now, there'll be a follow up to this in another year or two when a bunch of other sword movies come out. We've got to do 2.0. All right, so 2005 happens. Bobby and I, in our separate lives, because we didn't know each other, we go to the movie theater. Did you see it in the theater?
I did.
Okay.
I did.
We go to the movie theater. I'm going to describe my experience, and then you describe yours. I went to the movie theater to see this movie by Ridley Scott. I was really looking forward to it because it was set in a period of history that was of immense interest to me. I've read tons of books about it. I've studied it my whole life. Once again, this sword right here is from that time period. Like, this is part of that era. And I go to the theater. I like some of the performances. I like the props a lot. I like the costumes. Ridley Scott did it up to the nines. Movie at the time, wasn't so great. And I was like, oh, that's disappointing because they're probably never going to make a movie about this time period again in my lifetime. Not at this level, But then thankfully, in the Ridley Scott tradition, an extensive director's cut is released. And it is a completely different movie. And it's a better movie. And I fell in love with it. Bobby, what was your experience like with this film before we name it?
So I, leading up to it, seeing trailers and seeing teasers about it, I had loved everything Ridley Scott was doing. Mm-hmm. And I love epic movies, Braveheart, epic movie, grand scale. And I'm just like, wait a second. Ridley Scott is doing my favorite time period, the Crusades. And I was like, this is like, that's all you have to tell me. Sign me up. Let's go. Like, how could you go wrong? And from what I saw, like in the behind the scenes images and the trailer, I said, wait a second, this movie's going to be amazing. And I was like, it's going to win Oscars. It's going to be the greatest movie ever made. And I know, like, at the time you're talking 2005. So the internet was big, but it's not like it is now where like people are dissecting a trailer and this and that. But it was still in the early stages where I think people were like ridiculing the lead actor in it. And I was like, he's going to be great. Like, it's going to be great. It's good. And it was one of those things where I was talking to myself, I said, it's going to be an amazing movie. you know, and I went to go see it opening night, and I actually I loved it. I know a lot of people didn't really dig it the first time around. It was kind of everything I wanted, and yes, the story did have some plot holes, and there were things that I wanted out of it. Like I was like, oh, that villain never got to fight the hero, so but then the extended cut came out, and the hero and the villain got to fight each other, and it was everything I wanted.
Right.
But it was still what I wanted. It lived up to everything I wanted out of it. For the costumes and the weaponry, and everything seemed so realistic to me. There was nothing I was like, well, that's a little unrealistic. To me, it seemed authentic, and I fell in love with it. And I mean, you know, I couldn't wait. I think I saw it a couple times in the theaters. DVD came out. I immediately bought the DVD and just watched it all the time. And then, yes, I didn't know an extended version was coming out. I said, wait a second, my dreams came true. You mean to tell me that I wanted more out of a movie that I loved, and someone's giving me more of that movie, a 4-hour version of this movie? Yeah, all day. And watching it, you know, there's, and Ridley Scott even says in the beginning of it, he goes, it's not like little things where you're extending an intro and an outro, and the added stuff has meaning, very much like the Lord of the Rings extended cuts. Those scenes have meaning, and everything that was put into that movie to make it that 4-hour version, like everything is amazing. And I got that epic fight at the end, and that movie has my all-time favorite sword in it.
So that movie is Kingdom of Heaven with Orlando Bloom, and I agree, it is one of my favorite movies of all time when the extended cut finally came out. And I didn't actually watch the extended cut for several years. I'll admit it. Not because I was trying to thumb my nose at it, but just because it was like, oh, right, that movie. I'll get around to watching the extended cut at some point. I got to watch all the other Ridley Scott extended and director's cuts that I haven't seen first. But when I finally sat down and watched it, I went and bought it at a Best Buy like 4 or 5 years ago. And I was just like, man, this is such a superior experience. And at that point I was like, now, and this is what ticks me off, because I was already very connected to museum replicas from my original sword purchase and a number of other things. You know, that company is right here near me where I live. It's just like on the other side of Atlanta, and they have a showroom and everything. And at the time that movie came out, all the swords were being officially made by museum replicas. So they were functional. They were not stainless steel wall hangers, and they were all accurate based off the actual props from the Ridley Scott movie. They had access to those original props. I believe they might have even been the people that made them for the movie. Don't hold me to that, though. I can't remember. Well, the movie didn't do well because you and I both know why. Should have won Oscars, didn't.
Yeah.
And I hate myself for this, Bobby. I hate myself for this, because this was 2005. I was already out of grad school at that point. I was still getting the museum replicas catalogs every few months. Like it was once a quarter that they would send you a catalog in the mail.
Yeah.
Those swords were in that catalog. First as a new collection with the Shield of Balian and the surcoat, the Jerusalem surcoats and the Templar stuff. The swords, you had the sword of the Knight Hospitaller, you had the sword of the King of Jerusalem, you had the sword of Guy de Lusignan, you had the sword of Balian. But the movie flopped so bad, and I had disregarded anything about it. Those swords, which they say are some of the nicest swords that Museum Replicas has ever made, they all ended up on closeout for like less than $100 each. And I still did, like, I was getting the catalogs, and it was like slashed through the prices, and it was like $90 for the Sword of Balian, you know, like, and the scabbard and everything like that. And stupidly, I was just like, oh, it was that mediocre Crusader movie that disappointed me. And I could have afforded that. Even on my meager salary, I could have afforded that. And I didn't.
Wow.
And so you and I both had to go on this journey
Right.
to get this sword later at, you know, exponentially higher prices.
Yep.
Because it's very doubtful that anybody's going to relicense these swords ever again.
Yeah.
So yeah. So I know you just got yours.
I did.
It is the Sword of Balian of Ibelin, Orlando Bloom's sword from Kingdom of Heaven. Beautiful. Congratulations. Very nice.
Work
It
of
even
art.
looks sharpened.
It is sharpened. That's why I
Nice.
had to grab it by the middle of the blade because I almost cut myself when I took it out of the box.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This. Oh man, this sword, and you know, I kind of wish I had known about museum replicas back then. But even back then, I don't think I had the money to buy swords. So
Right.
you know, I don't. It would have been great to have a time machine to go back and get those. But
And that's my whole point. These things went on clearance, like deep
that's
closeout.
that's crazy.
They couldn't move them because nobody liked the movie.
Ugh.
And now, because of the extended cut, a lot of people love the movie.
Yep.
And now they want the swords, and that's why the swords are now in demand.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so for those of you listening, I didn't know about the museum replicas version.
Mm-hmm.
As Michael and I talked more, he told me about the museum replicas version because for the last couple of years,
Oh no!
Got him. I knew that was going to happen eventually.
Hey, you caught the important one.
I did catch the important one. So I didn't know about them, and I saw like, you know, crappy knockoff versions, you know, and they were just very poorly made. And I'm like, no, it's not what the sword actually looks like. And I never gotten one. Yes, I got some knockoff Lord of the Rings ones, but this sword, because it was my favorite sword, I felt like, well, I never wanted to get a knockoff version one, so I just never triggered. But then when you said, hey, there's a museum replicas version, I was like, my mind was blown. I looked up pictures of it, and I was like, that's the sword. Mm-hmm. So then from then on, it got added to my daily eBay lookup list. I have certain things I look for every day on eBay. And after we had talked, I spent every day looking, every day. And I was like, I'm never going to find this sword. Like, never. Because it was one of those things where it was like, I couldn't even find like sold listings or old listings. It was like one of these came up once a year. And that was it. And I was like, man. And then I was like, if it comes up, like, what's it, you know, how much is it going to be? And it just so happened that one came up and it was an absurd amount of money. Yeah. And I immediately sent it to Michael and I was like, dude, one just got listed.
Uh-huh.
And you were just like, wow, it's, you know, and yeah, it was a crazy amount of money. And I saw like there were several people watching it and I'm like, man, if someone else gets it, I'm going to kick myself for not getting it. But I'm like, I really have to have that sword because it's like, once I knew that they made a version, I was like, that's it. I couldn't think of anything else. I had to have it.
Yep.
You know, so I messaged the seller and I waited, you know, I was watching it for about a week and I made an offer to the seller and he took it. It was still an absurd amount of money. Something I probably wouldn't tell my wife, but it came and I took it out of the box and I should have done like an unboxing video because it was everything I had hoped it was, you know, and then some, like just to hold the sword and everything you saw on screen of it, you know, because he talks about the sword a little bit in the movie, but you don't really get a really great look of it, you know, and there's not a lot of great pictures online, but then seeing it, the fact that the pommel has, you know, wood, but then it has this dried leather wrap here, which on the knockoffs, it's wood, and that's how you can tell like the knockoffs are wrong because in the movie it almost looks ivory, and that's what I thought it actually was. But this, you know, this version, it's dried out, you know, thin leather and wrapped around probably wood, and then it's got like a metal braid inlay here, which is really nice. And then, you know, they look like panthers or you know, some sort of cat with smaller ears on the cross guard. And it's the cross guard's important because in the movie, when Liam Neeson's training Orlando Bloom, he goes to hit him with the cross guard and he says, you know, the blade's not the only part of a sword.
Right.
and Orlando Bloom uses, the cross guard, when they're fighting, he's fighting someone later. So it's that part of the sword as a weapon as well. And it's the perfect length blade. It's the perfect size, to wield one-handed or two-handed. It's perfect. The sword is perfect. It is a real world version of Aragorn's Ranger Sword in my mind.
Yeah.
Which I don't, you're like, well, it's, the Aragorn Ranger Sword's, it's real. You can hold it. But, that's a fantasy movie. And
Right.
although there are no fantasy elements to it, it's like, that's the best way I can almost describe it. So,
yeah, it is slightly, I love the sword, obviously. I have mine behind me. I'll grab it in a second. Because I got mine a few months before you got yours. I was checking the eBay listings forever, just trying to find one. And one came up, and they come up now because they're all secondhand. They come up in all various conditions. And I was really nervous because the one that had sold before, like, because some people, they put something up for a really absurd amount of money, and then they just wait for a sucker to come along. And the last one that had sold before I bought mine, the guy literally, whoever bought it, was like $1,100, no problem. And it's like, and the thing wasn't even in good shape. It looked like it had been used in mock combat. Like, it was really in bad shape. So I was, trying to be a smart buyer, but I know that in the period, but right there during the fall of Jerusalem, right before the Third Crusade, the two-handed bastard-style sword was still not the sword of the day. Like, it had not come around yet. It was still the arming sword, like I've shown a few times.
sure.
And I knew that in the film, but I also understood that, Ridley Scott was thinking visually. He was thinking about, we had just come off of the very successful Lord of the Rings trilogy in Hollywood that had taken the world by storm. And so everybody was used to the images of the hero with two hands, holding that sword. So I have to believe that was in his mind somewhere. But yeah, so when I found mine, because they're all in various conditions, not to give too much away to everybody here, but Bobby found a beautiful condition one, still with its original box and everything like that. I found, and you have the display plaque for yours, which came standard with the sword. When mine was found, put this on the right side this time. Mine was found, or from a seller who no longer had the box. He no longer had the display plaque, but he had purchased the scabbard and sword belts that was sold with Museum Replicas collection. This is Balian's sword, scabbard, belt, and sword. And so I was like, well, it's a fair trade. Like, if I can't get the box and the display plaque, well, at least I get the official movie scabbard and belt, on trade. And so I was thrilled. It's in really good shape, like yours. It's sharpened. I'm trying to catch it in the light there, but yeah, it's in real good condition. And it definitely is, like you, Bobby. It is my favorite movie sword of all time, I would think. With a close second being a toss-up between Errol Flynn's sword in Robin Hood and the Ninjato. So I guess I am a lover of fake swords, is what I am. I love fake swords. But yeah, this is a prized possession. I have a feeling that the guy wore this to some Renaissance festivals, not because the sword's in bad condition, because you can't pull a sword at a Ren Fest, but because the scabbard and belt has some mild usage to it. It's not damaged, but you can tell it's, the leather has bled from some sweat and everything like that, with the dye and stuff. But I think that gives it character. So
sure. Now I'm going to look out for the scabbard, because I'm just like, oh, I got to have the scabbard now. However, the interesting thing, when this showed up on eBay, the guy had the box, had the plaque, didn't have the original COA with it, which I found interesting. However, at the very same time, someone was selling just the COA, and I was like, and a totally different seller. And I'm like, wait a second, that seems almost too good to be true.
Yeah.
The COA was $8, and I'm
Yeah.
like, sure, I'll buy that. So now
Right.
it's
So now you've
you know,
completed it again. It's all as it was, brand
yeah,
new museum replicas. Yeah.
yeah. So
That's great.
I can't wait. This is I got the new office finally, and I'm in the process of setting that all up. And
Mm-hmm.
this is going right by my desk in the new office. I'm very excited to hang this one.
And I should have mentioned that. Oddly enough, he did have the COA for this, and
Oh, okay,
he sent that to me in an envelope. That's why I didn't remember. It's laying over there.
gotcha.
But that was a nice ad, for that, because like I don't have the box and I don't have the scabbard, but the plaque, but I do
Yeah,
have the COA and the belt and stuff. So yeah, and so it was a fair trade off. Let's see real quick. We have some super chats here. Andrew, thank you for the super chat. He says, 1, love retro blasting in Valaverse. 2, best sword is obviously the singing sword Eddie Valiant wielded in Who Framed Roger Rabbit. Good point. Wicked witchcraft. And I just demonetized this whole live stream. And then Bradshaw Studios, thank you for the super sticker. Appreciate that. Yeah. Sam says Sam is a little upset. These guys just want to be English knights. It's no way the best movie sword. Come to England. I'll get you some real old sword. Ditch that rubbish. Now, Sam, I appreciate your sentiment. I need to recommend that maybe you take a few breaths into a paper bag or something like that. You're getting a little worked up with all caps, but you haven't insulted us, so we love you, buddy. So yeah. So anyway, so yeah, have you seen? I wanted to bring this up real quick, Bobby. I know that we're at the end of the stream here, but have you seen any movies with swords and blades in the last few years that have made the same impact on you as the ones we just talked about?
the only thing close I would say is probably Game of Thrones.
Uh-huh.
But even there, like Game of Thrones was another thing. I didn't read the books. I just got into the series and loved the series. Fell in love with the series until the last 2 seasons, just like kind of everyone else. But the swords, the costumes are fantastic in that series. But the swords are great. I think they're missing something. They're missing some of that I don't know what it is, because I can't say character, because Jon Snow has Longclaw, which is a nice looking sword, and it's got a wolf head on the pommel, but there's something about that sword that looks a little cheap. Ned Stark's giant sword Ice,
Yeah.
It's kind of where I go back to like absurdly large swords. There's something about the swords that I wasn't in love with, and I felt like it's a medieval series. It has everything I would want, but there was just something about them that I felt like, well, between Lord of the Rings and Kingdom of Heaven, that's tough company, man. And I felt like Game of Thrones just wasn't getting there.
Yeah.
But that it was close, but just not. I had everything I loved with those two. All those movies, and not Game of Thrones.
I just watched for the first time Ridley Scott's Robin Hood, and not a good movie.
Not a good movie.
No.
Big disappointment. Yeah.
Yeah, and at first, the only thing that was getting me through the movie was the fact that the period of time that they were in was almost like Kingdom of Heaven 2.0 at the beginning, because it was after King Richard had come back from, because Kingdom of Heaven ends with Richard coming through that French village asking for directions, and Balin telling him, keep going east until they don't speak English, and then keep going, or they speak a different language or something like that. And I was disappointed immediately on 2 fronts. I was like, come on, Ridley, you couldn't get the same guy that played Richard at the end of Kingdom of Heaven.
How cool would that have been?
That'd been awesome, right? But then on the other side of it, I was like, oh, well, the bows and the swords are pretty nice, as I would expect, because I found out that all the costuming was re-rented from what they used in Kingdom of Heaven. So,
okay.
Robin Hood, or Robin Longstride, as he's called, he gets that sword off of Robert of Locksley.
Yep.
And I was like, oh, wow, that's a really nice sword. And then within 5 minutes on a scene on that boat, he inexplicably starts unwrapping the wire grip. And I'm like, what?
What
Why
made
are
that
you
sword
doing
great?
that? Say what?
Yeah, what made that sword great? A great design element. Just
Yeah. Also that he could reveal calligraphy underneath that was engraved into the hilt. And
Yeah.
I'm going, why would he know to do that? Why would he do that? And it actually makes the sword kind of look uncomfortable and ugly. And
Well,
I'm like,
doesn't he, part of the wiring comes undone and he cuts his finger, and
well,
then
maybe,
and
yeah.
then he looks at it and he starts to unravel, but still I felt it very unnecessary to do.
Yeah, it was like, oh, and when Museum Replicas did the sword for that, and I was like, oh, well, maybe they've got the wire. No, the wire's not on there. And I'm like, well, then I don't want it, because forget it. So yeah. Let me just see if we've got any more chats here. Any more all caps ravings? No, we don't. Bobby, any parting thoughts on movie swords and anything like? I thought I had a question for you that was going to wrap all this up very nicely, and then I lost it. Hold on, give me 1 second. I'm going to access my
Sure.
filing cabinet. To you, there's been a lot of debate in the chat tonight about, what makes a good movie sword, and some people are saying all movie swords are rubbish and all kinds of stuff, which it's called favorite movie swords, dude. It's not called favorite swords. So I don't know why you walked into this saloon. But Matthew, thank you for the super chat. He says, not a sword, but I'm really liking the battle axe in the new Green Knight trailer. Oh, good. And what do you, to sum up, what is it that captivates you about a sword in a movie? And also, have you ever seen a movie where the movie was crap, but you liked the weaponry in it anyway? I have found that if the movie's garbage, I lose interest in the accessories. I lose interest in the swords, no matter how nice they are.
Yeah.
Same like with Robin Hood. That movie was Russell Crowe one was not good. And so what was an almost nice sword became a completely forgettable and unwanted thing. So what's your take on that? Like, what makes a great movie sword to you? And also, do you have any movies where you didn't like the film, but you still really love the weaponry?
Sure. I think what makes a good movie sword, it's a fine balance. It's a balance of function and character. The sword has to be a character in itself, but it also can't steal the show. It like the claymore from Braveheart, I think sort of steals the show. It's its own entity, but it doesn't match well with him. So it has to match the character. Like going back to Aragorn's Ranger sword, the sword is almost an extension of the character. But whereas if you had the sword by itself, you would know that's its own character, but also who that character goes to.
Yeah.
So, but also, function. You can't look at a sword and say like the sword of Gryffindor or the claymore. It's like those swords are just, the function's not there. It's, you're going into battle. You want this at your side. And to me, that it's that delicate balance. And I think, I don't think there are enough movies. Like, think of all the movies that have had swords. I don't think they think about that. I'm sure the prop master, the armor, they put some thought into, but not the way the guys at like Weta do.
Right.
And, as amazing as this sword is, I would have loved to have seen what the guys at Weta would have done with Kingdom of Heaven.
Yeah.
But it's a very fine balance, to make sure that sword is iconic enough for you to fall in love with it. But I guess you have to love the character, because I agree with you that if the movie's crap, segueing into that, I have seen a crap movie that had great weapons when I look at it now, because when I was doing research for this, I was making sure I didn't miss anything. And there was a movie that came out around the same time as the first season of Game of Thrones. So Sean Bean was like, you know, typecast as the medieval guy, and he did this movie called Black Death, which was a direct to DVD movie. But it was kind of one of those things where I was always just going to buy movies. I'd go to Best Buy like every, I think, what was it, Tuesday or Wednesday movies came out. And I was like, I'll buy whatever new movies are out. And I saw like, oh, Sean Bean in a medieval movie where he's got a sword on the cover of the DVD. Sold. I'll buy that movie in a heartbeat. It was terrible. It was an awful, awful movie. The weaponry was fantastic though, but I lost interest in it, very much like Robin Hood, where I was just like, once you said the Robin Hood sword, I'm like, oh, I didn't even think of the Robin Hood sword because the movie sucked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I think we're definitely in the same boat with that one. So, what are your thoughts on both those points?
I lose interest immediately. Like I lost opportunities to get all the Kingdom of Heaven swords at deep discount because I didn't like the theatrical cut of the movie. And then when I fell in love with it as a director's cut, and it was the movie I'd mostly hoped for. And I'm only saying that because my knowledge of history of Balian and Vibolin runs counter to a lot of the first half of the movie. But I can still watch the movie as a Crusader movie, and I still love it just fine. I'm just saying. I'm doing one of those mental detours. But yeah, once I started loving the movie for what it was, suddenly I wanted the sword. And that goes for, you know, pretty much everything. Like I would never want the sword for Snake Eyes version 3. You know, I don't care about that weird looking, you know, blade thing with the big eagle claw pommel on it and stuff. I don't.
Yeah.
I would never want a sword from a Uwe Boll movie. However you pronounce his name, like Blood Rain or any of those terrible films. Would I love to have a Hattori Hanzo katana from Kill Bill? Sure, but I don't know where to get one of those in proper, you know, katana folded steel or whatever. And that would be prohibitively expensive even if I could find it. That's what keeps me from the Connor McLeod katana from Highlander, because I don't want to buy you end up paying for a brand new stainless steel non-functional katana the same price that we paid to get functional museum replicas quality Balian swords. I can't justify that logically just to get a sword from a movie about immortal people that cut their own heads off.
Sure.
Like I can't, cut each other's heads off. They don't cut their own heads off. That would be a funny movie though. So I got to win this fight. So yeah, and Wicked Person, thank you for the final super chat of the night, I believe. He says, story swords are aspirational. Luke meets his shadow self on Dagobah, but Ben gives him a weapon that shows him who he can be, his light self. That is very true. That is very true. All right. Well, Bobby, is there anything that you wanted to bring up that I haven't discussed tonight?
I think the only point I'll kind of end with is, going forward, what is the future of movie swords? And I think like, okay, well, the 2000s we had Lord of the Rings, and then 2005 we had, Kingdom of Heaven. And then I said how, in the later 2000s we had Game of Thrones, and that was a little disappointing for me. And I just think that, the trends of movies, I don't know if we'll ever get an epic scale movie like Kingdom of Heaven or Braveheart again, because I think that, we're moving towards CGI heavy movies, and, fantasy stuff is very heavy fantasy. It doesn't have that layer of real period medievalness to it. So it's unfortunate to think that maybe we won't get like that next sword that really blows us away. Now, granted, the Amazon Lord of the Rings series is coming out. I don't know. I haven't heard much about it. I don't know if they're using Weta. I am interested to see that series and see how everything looks. Maybe that is going to be something that reinvigorates that the new love of swords, what that next, hot, great movie sword is. but I just think we might be past that, after, and that's the unfortunate thing about certain movies failing. Like when Robin Hood came out, like I talked it up like I talked up Kingdom of Heaven. I said, it's
Right.
Ridley Scott. He doesn't make a bad movie. It's Robin Hood. It's going to be a better version of Prince of Thieves. And it came out and I was like, wow, that movie sucked. It was such a disappointment, but I'm like, now it's like, okay, well, Kingdom of Heaven didn't do well. Robin Hood didn't do well. It's like no one's going to give Ridley Scott money to do an epic scale medieval movie again. So we're kind of SOL on that one, and that's unfortunate.
Well, the biggest disappointment was that the extended cut of that movie didn't help it at all.
Yeah.
That movie didn't, and I point to two things. I don't have a problem with Russell Crowe as a performer. I like Gladiator. I liked crap, what's the movie I'm trying to think of? I like Russell Crowe. I don't have a problem with Russell Crowe as a performer, is all I'm saying. My mind's blanking on his film library right now, but I don't think he should have been Robin Hood. Ironically or coincidentally, I think Orlando Bloom would have been a much better Robin Hood.
Sure.
I think he looks the part more, and he would have been younger and younger-ish. But of course, you can't get around the writing of that movie. The writing killed that movie in its tracks. It's a Robin Hood movie where he never gives back to the poor.
I know.
It's like he basically impersonates somebody, gets a manor house, and then decides to fight an invasion for a corrupt king to help him out. And it's like, this is not Ridley. I don't know where your brain was on this, but this is not the mythology here. This is not the legend. So yeah, you're right that if a movie fumbles, you can lose interest in the window dressing immediately. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So. Well, guys, thank you so much for being on this talk with us, and I want to thank Bobby for taking the time out of his night to come talk movie swords. This won't be the last time. I'm sure there will be some movie that comes up, and Bobby and I will be like, "Did you see the swords in that movie? Oh my God, put it on the list. We're gonna have to talk about that on the next one." Bobby, where can people find you?
You could find me everywhere: Facebook, Instagram, YouTube. Just look up Valaverse. There's the Valaverse page on Facebook and Instagram. There's also a great Legions of Valaverse fan page on Facebook. I'm also on the Infinity Equation podcast on Friday nights. It is a great show. We have to have Michael back on. It's always a good time. So come take a listen. We always have fun.
All right, everybody, we are going to leave now. You guys have a great night. Bobby, thank you again for being here. I have a few things to ask you right after the show, so stick around for just a second. Everybody else.
Thank you. This was, I love this. I love, we talk about a lot of pop culture and toys, but this was great to switch it up and talk about something we both love. So thanks for making it happen so quickly.
Absolutely. And thank you for indulging me. All right, everybody. We will see you soon.